Welcome to our Theological Thursdays weekly series, Thursdays at 1:30. Yes, last week we talked about the afterlife, maybe mostly focused on resurrection and the different themes. We'll post the link on YouTube, on the comments for our YouTube playlist, which has all our Theological Thursday videos in one playlist. But today we're going to talk about specifically hell. And the approach that Jonathan and I usually take in these videos is to, instead of taking like a systematic approach, like what is hell, stuff like that, we actually try to take a more scriptural approach as to what terms and language does the scripture use when talking about hell. And then from there on, figuring out what are the questions biblical authors are asking, as opposed to the questions we're asking now. Would you say that's accurate, Jonathan, in the approach we're taking?
Yeah, I mean, that's a mouthful, but yes, it's definitely accurate. We're going to go through, the easier way to put it, I always say this, we're going to go through the culture and context of Scripture in order to do our best to respond to some of these theological musings that we have, for sure.
Great. So hell is a topic you've preached on a couple of times, Jonathan. I guess the question is pretty simple. Does it exist? I think most people's conception of it is eternal punishment with fire, and something that happens to you if you don't believe in the good news of Jesus, or maybe if you're very evil. It's unclear. And if you're Catholic, you have some understanding of purgatory as well. What's your general overview of how you respond when someone asks you that question?
Somebody asks about hell. Yeah, I think we have to go back and remember that last week when we talked about afterlife, we said that we do believe that there is an afterlife, right? We said we believe there's a heaven, and that in the Jewish tradition, you believe in an afterlife called Sheol, which is kind of neutral. It's not necessarily heaven. It's not necessarily hell. It's just it is. It just is. But what's really interesting is I think what people are asking is, you have these verses and I'll read them. I think Matthew 5:22, it says, anyone who says you fool will be in danger of the fire of hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to burn in hell, right? And we look at this and we absolutely think that these are afterlife issues. So what is Jesus referring to? Well, we have to jump all the way back to the Old Testament, to Leviticus. And in Leviticus, we had an issue. And the issue was that people were sacrificing their children, which is a real problem. They were sacrificing their children to the god Molech. And what they would do is they would sacrifice their children through fire. So I know this isn't pleasant. This is actually kind of messed up. As we go through Scripture, especially in the Old Testament, you can point out 5 or 6 different places they talk about this. And it's called the Valley of Ben Hinnom every time. So whenever you see the Valley of Ben Hinnom, people are talking about a sacrifice of children. It sort of gets a really bad reputation for real obvious reasons. This is the place where you made some really terrible choices, and you did it with fire usually. And so in the Jewish tradition, the Valley of Ben Hinnom actually gets so terrible of a reputation that they have to rename it. They rename it Gehenna. And Gehenna is a real place. It's actually a real place outside of the walls of Jerusalem. And while we don't know for sure what it was used for, we're pretty certain that in some cases it was used to, when a criminal died or someone who had no family member died, they would be thrown into the Valley of Gehenna. It was a place where trash was burned, a lot of people think. That was a place where it was. So when you think about lake of fire, and you're living in, a city or you're living in a state the size of Houston, everybody's going to know what that place is, right? It's Gehenna. It looks like a lake of fire. People are burning there. It's got a terrible connotation. It's a bad place. And the big thing, and this is the big thing, is it is outside of the city. So it's outside of where people congregate. It's outside of where people gather. It's outside of where people come together to celebrate. It's outside of where people come together to worship. It truly is like a terrible outside place that's burning, right? It's literal. So when Jesus is saying, hey, better to cut off one hand than to have your body thrown into hell, he's saying better to do that than to be basically banished from all the good that you know, all the beauty that you know in this space, and being banished outside of it to the place where things are literally burning and garbage is literally burning. And the place where when criminals die, where criminals are burning, and the place where thousands of years ago they burned children when they worshipped other gods. Better for you to cut off the part of yourself that's stopping you from communion with others than to actually go to this physical place that cuts you off from all of that.
So you're kind of saying that Jesus is making more an ethical point than a metaphysical point, almost. Like he's making a point about how terrible it is to do terrible things to children or to hate your brother or something like that. Then he is making a point about what happens if you do so.
Jesus is definitely, well, I won't say definitely. Nothing is ever definite when it comes to Scripture. But Jesus is talking about something happening in the here and now. And when we talk about the here and so Jesus is here and now. And what is happening is Jesus is saying in the here and now, anything that cuts you off from communion, from celebration, from the ability to love or be loved, from the ability to give of yourself to others and receive from others, anything that cuts you off from that is akin to being in this valley that we all know, we all see as death. I remember one time I was preaching on it, and I was like, so many New Yorkers, we look across the river at Jersey and we're kind of like, ugh. And imagine looking across the river and seeing the Valley of Ben Hinnom or Gehenna, whatever it's called, and knowing that's a terrible place over there. I don't want to go over there.
Right.
It's like Jersey times 1,000.
Sorry to everyone there. We do have now people streaming in from all across New York State, tri-state area. Jonathan, we can't alienate our consumer-based.
I actually love Jersey. I love Jersey a lot, actually.
Yeah, and I'm a Jersey fan too, the Garden State. And it's interesting your point you make about child sacrifice, because the two passages I think that Jesus talks particularly about Gehenna had to do with he talks specifically about children. Like if you cause one of these little children to stumble and fall, it is as if it's better off. It is worse than if you were to go burn in this lake in the Gehenna area. So he's almost flipping the paradigm around children. If that's a place where children were sacrificed, now he's saying if you treat children terribly, you deserve almost to go to that place, something like that. Maybe deserve is the wrong word, but
I like that. I like that a lot. I think it's probably that's some of the stuff we miss when we read Scripture. Some of these little cultural references that people at that time would absolutely get. That we're like, huh? But yeah, I think he's saying better for you to you would be doing this to kids if you're not treating them with their full humanity. Yeah.
Can you talk to me about Hades? Oh, did you want to say something?
No, I'm good. Yeah.
I feel like Hades is the other Greek word that comes out a bunch. It comes up in, I think, the book of Acts. It comes out in Abraham and Lazarus story in the Gospel of Luke. A couple more times in Matthew and obviously in Revelation, stuff like that. What's the deal there? Is that Sheol or?
So that's a good question. I don't know for sure. What I can tell you is that as the Roman Empire, creates a quote unquote melting pot of all these different cultures and all these different states, all these different nations, you end up, culturally blending. And that's what happens. And so obviously Greek culture is huge, and Greek culture believes in Hades. And what's interesting is the more I read about Hades, the more it was more like Sheol. It was more of a neutral place rather than like the awful place. But I still need to learn a lot about that. But basically, if you're writing in the Greek, you're basically going to call it's the place. It's the same kind of place if you're writing in the Greek that Gehenna is, right? That's basically the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll just sorry to interrupt you, Sarah, but I was gonna say that whenever Jesus is talking about hell, Jesus is talking about a literal place on earth. Like that's what Jesus is talking about. In some instances, he might be talking about Sheol, which is that Jewish tradition of the afterlife. But again, because it's neutral, it's hard to really know for sure. And there are people who will tell me that opinion is wrong, and they have different thoughts on it. Worth checking all of it out. But for the most part, most scholars believe that that's the case.
And that has very interesting kind of political implications as we think about like what is our modern day equivalent of Gehenna. Is it, our mass incarceration system? Is it an ICE detention center? What are the places where people are sent in some ways legitimately in some ways sent to suffer or sent to die in some ways?
Yeah.
And James Cone, I think, writes a bit about this. I don't know if you want to say a bit more about that.
I think it's anytime we take humanity away from someone else, we're kind of sending them to hell. Or anytime we lose parts of our humanity, we're sending ourselves to that separation from God, that place where we're not able to commune with others, the place where we can't love and be loved. And so I know that Cone, it's worth reading, will say that, the horrors of slavery, of enslaving people, is its own version of hell, because basically you have a group of people who believe that another group of people are subhuman, aren't worthy of that kind of communion, of that kind of love, and that would be its own hell here on earth. I know I wrote about, this is last June, I wrote about feeling like hell are people who are separating families at the border, and so children being kept in cages, that's hell. It's an intentional act that takes away the ability for communion. It's awful. That's hell. It's hell here on earth. And most of the time when we're talking about it, we are talking about, are we losing bits of our humanity? Are we losing the ability to love and to be loved? Are we losing the ability to see others as fully made in the image of God? Every time that's the case, it's a little bit of hell.
Yep. I know last week Sue Ann brought up the question of what implications does this belief in heaven and hell and the afterlife have on what our take on evangelism is, and maybe we can dedicate a kind of video, perhaps just to where it's like, does Forefront evangelize? What's our stance? In short, if someone asks me that, I always say, I think we're more interested in helping people follow the way of Jesus, not necessarily believe in Jesus, if that makes sense. And Jesus always says, follow me, not necessarily, believe in me per se. But we can expand that in another video, unless you have a short thing you also want to say, Jonathan.
I always say this. I always say that I'm more of an evangelical now than I ever have been. More so because, evangelical, it literally means go tell the good news. And to me, it's good news when we follow Jesus Christ, who shows us that it's, that real humanity happens in selflessness rather than selfishness. And it's good news when you are included full stop, regardless of who you are or how you, identify.
Right.
That's good news. And it's good news when you're like, you know what? It's a communal worship. Communal worship is good news. So I think we still evangelize. I still evangelize. I still people hey, when you stop the heaven and hell and start to focus on a kingdom here on earth, that's really good news that we all can get behind. It's really good news when we include everybody. It's really good news when we don't think God hates us. It's really good news when we recognize that we are made perfectly in the image of God and can share that with one another. So it's shifting.
Okay. I still have more questions, but to wrap up, I think there's some follow-ups with the evangelism thing. To wrap up the heaven hell thing, though, I think one thing I do like about the traditional idea of heaven hell, to be quite honest, is that I like the idea that there is some kind of judgment, some kind of accountability at the end, because we see all the time of good people who suffer and bad people who live like kings and really nothing bad happens to them. Maybe they have depression. I don't know. So, this is a different topic, but any thoughts on do we have a stance on internal judgment, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, that's good. I think one of the biggest misconceptions around judgment, because I believe judgment is needed as well. I believe accountability is needed as well. But one of the biggest misconceptions I think around judgment is that judgment deserves punishment. And I don't think that's the way God operates. I think God says judgment deserves restoration. And those are very different ideas or very different thoughts. And so if we're going to put judgment in the context of hell, I get asked this all the time. So what do we do when we die and what will happen? Well, first of all, none of us know. I have no idea. But when I think we stand before God, I think God says, this is me and my glory. And this is what the kingdom of heaven looks like. And it's amazing and it's beautiful and it's infinite and it's unimaginable. And I want to restore you and reconcile you to this place. Judgment says that you're probably not worthy of this place, but I want to restore and reconcile you to this place. And then I think there's a point that we have this choice. Do we want to be restored and reconciled into the glory of God? Or have we lost so much of our humanity that we want to be outside of it, that we want to separate ourselves from it? It's actually, and this is going to be controversial, it's actually what Rob Bell basically says in his book, Love Wins, which you can read. I liked it. I thought it was great.
I'll post it in the comments.
Yeah, you could post it in the comments for sure.
So we're team well.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, I think judgment for God is never about punishment, but always about restoration. That's what I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. If you have questions or comments, post them. I didn't see any, but maybe we'll try to get to them next week. This is also recorded and we'll post on YouTube and yada yada. So it's all good. So next week, what are we talking about, Jonathan?
I don't think we've decided yet, Sarah.
That's true. All right, we'll think of a topic.
Well, I don't think we have to think of a topic. I feel like these Theology Thursdays are letting people know what our church believes about heaven and hell and Jesus and all the rest. So I think it's a matter of just saying, oh, our church believes about these things. But hey, if you want to, if you have a topic you're interested in, post it in the comments. We're happy to use one of those and talk about that next week.
Yep. All right, we'll come up with something. See y'all next Thursday.
All right, see y'all.